Hackett teaches at Seattle Central Community College, and she is going to lead us today, and she said, just introduce me, and I'll go ahead and give the directions for what we're going to do. So thank you, Dr. Hackett, for coming and spending an hour or so with us today. And thank you to John Dunn with Call to Action, who said, yes, go ahead with this. And thank you to Dan Tomasz, who's been leading the groups that have been reading Robin DiAngelo's book.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's just an honor and a pleasure to be here with you this morning.
Would you mind speaking a little louder?
St. Patrick's is very reminiscent of the church that I grew up in, Loyola, in Denver, Colorado. And I attended Annunciation Middle School and high school, and then Gonzaga for a year. And then came over here to the University of Washington and graduated in psychology. By training, I'm a developmental psychologist with a specialty in early childhood education. That's what I thought I would spend my career doing, but I ended up with a PhD in organization psychology, and I spent my career working mostly with companies, high-tech companies early on in the 80s, and then social service agencies beginning in 2000 for almost the last 18 years. I've been working with social service agencies to, first in corporations, humanize the workplace. You know, that we're not automatons, we're actually people who work in companies. And then in social services, to really understand what it means to be fair and equitable and deliver our services in a way that is fair and equitable for everyone. So I've worked with folks in high tech used to say to me, well, isn't it very different working with adults, having spent so long working with young children? And I would say, well, not really. You know, and when I work in companies and systems, it's use your words, play nicely, share. So not really all that different, right? So what I've said to Robin, who I've had the pleasure to know, I've been teaching at Seattle Central College since 2011. And I was recruited, actually, because I was not intending to be an academician at all. I have a consulting firm, and I have a client load, and I work in systems. And mostly I'm working in how we change systems, how we transform systems into the 21st century. But I was recruited by the dean at that time in the Department of Applied Behavioral Sciences, and we give a BA degree to folks who are going to work or are already working in the human services. And so I was asked to come and teach a course in cross-cultural competence in the human services. And since then, which is so typical of colleges if you're familiar with them, I've taught quantitative research principles, I've taught public policy analysis, academic writing, been the field placement coordinator. Just roll up your sleeves and pitch in. And I'm happy to do that. I have learned so much from students and former students. Robin was one of my students years ago. Learned so much about what is happening today in the world. They keep me apprised of what is happening today in the world. And that is so important. So I think of this morning as more let's call it a facilitated dialogue. And as we chat, I would like you to feel free to introduce yourselves as you are comfortable introducing yourselves. And the one thing I want you to think about if you choose to introduce yourself, is the answer to the question, why am I here? Why am I in this room at this moment? Why am I here? Because I believe that everyone who's supposed to be here is here, and we are all here for any number of reasons, some of them of which are known to us, and some we will discover as we move through the day, and for some of us it will be after today. Oh, that's what that conversation was about. My name is Wanda Hackett, from my African tradition. And in the African tradition, you are given a name that you aspire to. So Mwanana Kiongozi means gentle leader. And I was given it when I was about 20 years old. And not at all a gentle leader. And some would maybe question if I'd even grown into my name as of today. I am adoptive daughter of the Blackfeet Nation. Nutoi Kasi Aki. And when I was adopted by the Blackfeet because of some work that I did with them for a number of years in the child welfare system, they honored me with this name, which means Holy Medicine Woman. And when they gave it to me, I said, oh no, another big name to grow into? We are aspiring. We are aspiring. Human beings aspire. That's probably the lesson of my 70 years. We aspire. We don't become. And we're often shocked and surprised when we realize that sometimes we have become less than we thought we had become. But we aspire. And that's what's important. So I asked Robin what St. Patrick's was aspiring to. And I've been giving it some thought, mulling over it. I got a glimpse in church today of what you're aspiring to. So I would invite anyone to introduce themselves and share with me, because you all know, what you're aspiring to as a church community. Amen.
I'll start.
I'm Jan Thomas, and it's my hope that we aspire to greater racial justice and inclusion and awareness.
That's a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's not just our lifetime of work. When I was younger, I thought we would get it all done in my lifetime. I'm a little wiser now, and I'm thinking it's going to take many lifetimes. So inclusion, justice, and awareness. Would anyone add something to that?
I'm Kathleen. I have become aware the last few years of the issue of white privilege, which has existed, but I wasn't aware of it. And so I think I want to become more aware of the specifics of it and how I participate in that. Or maybe unjust or unfair things that I am doing.
Well, that's a wonderful aspiration, Kathleen.
Well, but like you say, it's an aspiration.
Yes. Welcome. Welcome.
My name's Dominic Wetzler, and I know in some circles, like in Alcoholics Anonymously, I'm an alcoholic. In this circle, I would say I am a racist. The reason I would say that is so that I understand that I have thoughts and patterns that I need to change and to do something about that. And I want to aspire to understanding what I need to do to change and what I need to do to be more understanding. And I've been with Jan and her group, and it's just a word to make me more aware.
Welcome, Dominic. Anyone else?
I am Elaine, and for this community, what I aspire to is justice for women and women's gifts within the Catholic tradition, and for the evolution of community and deep sharing on many levels. So spiritual, material, whatever, well, that's the ends of the spectrum, so whatever is there in between. And of the language that we use, that we are able to worship using language that we relate to.
Welcome. Anyone else? And we don't have to do it at this moment. And as things evolve, you might want to introduce yourself and answer that question. Or other questions that may emerge over the next hour or so.
My name is Kate, and I think we like to think of ourselves as a social justice community, and I would like to see us increasingly realize that that is our aspiration. We're not all that, and we've got a ways to go. So I think these sorts of conversations are really helpful for that.
Welcome. Well, let me ask another question. And then you might want to introduce yourself, and then you might want to respond to this question. What do you think is the difference between welcoming and inclusive? What is the difference between welcoming, genuinely welcoming, and genuinely inclusive?
I'm Maureen. I think welcoming is that initial step, introducing yourself, getting to know their name, and so it's kind of like that beginning step. I think to be inclusive goes much deeper. It has to do, like what Elaine said, about language, about our attitudes, about how we conduct our lives. So it's more at a deeper kind of transformational level to be inclusive.
Exactly. Nicely said. And in saying it, you actually articulated some depth, right? Our language. And then what did you say?
I can't remember. I think our attitudes, and then it talked about, and then I talked about transformation in the next bit.
So we kind of get the first stage is in our language is so close to our thinking, right? I have a 3.5-year-old grandson who is just the delight of my life. I really didn't have any understanding of what it meant to be a grandparent until I had my grandson. And if you could just skip parenting, those of you who are grandparents know what I'm talking about. We just go right to grandparenting. It would be fabulous, but I guess that's not fabulous. And he reminds me, so he's learning language, right? And my niece, when we were ever at a family gathering, she terms this conversations with Nana. Because this 3.5-year-old and I will be engaged in tremendous conversations.
Could you speak up, please?
This 3.5-year-old and I will be engaged in tremendous conversations. Because remember my origins, developmental psychologist, early childhood educator. So clearly my little laboratory. And I'm really into the brain development research right now. But to see it unfold and manifest in front of you, and it's all about language and our thinking and how closely tied they are. Closely tied they are. And it's wonderful to be a part of the development of someone's language and thinking. And I'm sure I was there for my son, but I was a working mother. So I couldn't be as present as I am with this little one. And so it's that kind of presence. Remind me your name?
Maureen?
Maureen and Dominic are talking about. It's a kind of presence with concepts that we're exposed to prior to our birth. See, we get this information. We don't have to do anything to get it. But it's a lot of work to unpack it. I think that's what you are describing. It's a lot of work to unpack it and really understand not just what it means, understanding is important, and how it feels. Father's talking about emotions this morning. How it feels, because in the way the brain develops, we develop at the emotional level first, and then at the thinking level. So Maya Angelou has a saying, people will forget what you did, and people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's because we developed our emotional senses first. So unpacking what privilege means. So those of you who have been studying Robin DiAngelo and others, how would you define privilege? Someone?
I'm John, and thank you, Jen, for the work you did with our group. Privilege is something that we're not really aware of, I think, especially in the case of white privilege. Because of what you said earlier, it's something that we have to unpack because we're not aware that it even exists. When we began our group, which not one of us said, well, I'm a racist. Not one of us. But when we got into the book and got into that depth, we began to realize, yeah, I have a college education because my dad specifically was able to rise to the top of a construction company. He started out as a carpenter. And when we look back at it, how many black laborers and carpenters, or how many Native American laborers or carpenters that he worked with, and he worked with Native Americans a lot in Montana, how many of them were able to rise to that position and able to give their children black? I was not even aware. privilege. I'm 2 years with privileges.
And I'm gonna stop calling folks by name, because now you've exceeded my capacity. I think I'm like 7 in now. Best I can do.
It's better than me.
But I want to play a little bit with something that John, I can remember those names in a moment though. Memory hasn't failed me yet. That I read and teach a text similar to Robin DiAngelo's by a sociologist, Alan Johnson, Power, Privilege, Power, and Difference. And he defines privilege as when one receives unearned advantages. Unearned advantages. Social privilege, that he's a sociologist, so he's talking about at the societal level. When the society conveys unearned advantages. So I experienced and was very conscious of my privilege in Mass today, in that I could walk into the church and into the pew with absolutely no difficulty whatsoever. But there were folks with walkers for whom that was not the case. So the designers of pews, this is happening at a societal level, it's not a person, right, in front of us. The designers of pews, historically, hundreds of years, have designed church pews for which privilege group? Able-bodied. So my ease in going to Mass and sitting at something as simple as sitting in the church, getting into the church pew, is an unearned advantage. It didn't take a PhD, that would have meant it was an earned advantage. Right? It was an unearned advantage. And so when we think about privilege, it's gender privilege was raised today, race privilege, but there are so many other privileges that we experience. And like race privilege, they too are unconscious, because they are integrated into the very fabric of the society that we live in. So, Alan Johnson says, privilege is the experience of never having to think about the experience of the unprivileged. I don't think prior to today I have ever given any conscious and deliberate thought to the difficulty someone with a walker would have in getting into a pew in church. Never gave it any thought, never thought about it. Consulted to countless companies, never would have raised it as a consideration that we might have to make when we design buildings, work with engineering companies, manufacturing companies. That's how our privilege works. That's how our privilege operates. And first of all, it's just unconscious. And then, as you know, we're unpacking. So it's unconscious. But unfortunately, it impacts our decisions, which can affect other people in dramatic ways. And Alan Johnson calls that, when we're unconscious of it, we take paths of least resistance. We've always done it. It's always been this way. This is the way we do it. It's the path of least resistance. We just carry on with the status quo. And it is that which is dangerous. That's what's dangerous. Because once we are conscious of it, one of my students said this to me, I was teaching at Antioch. And I require that my students have to spend 11 weeks researching and examining social injustice. We don't just talk about it in class and listen, we talk about it from a theoretical perspective. They have to go out in the world and find an example of injustice and research it. And then they have to create a social change project where they have to actually engage people in making a change. And it takes about 7 weeks before students even believe that they're going to have to go do something. Resisting the whole way. They keep thinking, I'm only going to have to make a presentation, right, Dr. Wanda? And I keep saying, no. You're actually going to have to go out into the world and tell people about your research and describe what the research says are the solutions and get people to become allies and advocates for whatever this issue was that you believe is important. So I had this student at Antioch, this was years ago before I started teaching at Seattle Central. And first of all, the students initially said they were being oppressed. That they absolutely were not going to do this, it was oppressive. The analogy to that at Seattle Central is that it takes 3 or 4 weeks before the students will come up with their topic. And finally they come to class and they say, I can't find anything. And I say, okay, well, what keywords did you use in your research? But they didn't use words like discrimination and service disparities. And I said, oh no, you got to use those words. You've got to say the words. Because it's just a machine. If you don't say the words, if you don't type in the words, nothing will come up. Well, that's the same thing that Dominic described earlier. We've got to become aware of what's in our thinking, because our thinking informs our language, informs our actions, and the vast majority of it is unconscious. Totally unconscious. And the term for that is implicit bias. So I had this, I'm digressing a little bit, but I'll come back to where I was, hopefully. I had this moment during Mass when Father said, confess our sins. And I wondered how many of us confessed our implicit bias. Now, let alone our explicit bias. That I think and speak and behave in ways that oppress people every day, and I am totally unaware of it. Because it's our implicit bias that is the problem. Our explicit bias, well, that's me too. Our explicit bias can be taken care of with laws and policies and procedures. If you step so far over the line, right? That's explicit bias. You step way over the line. but it is the everyday, unconscious bias that is killing people emotionally every day. That is what kills people emotionally.
Do you think, because we never acknowledged or really identified that whole piece about changing the implicit bias, or bought into that during the civil rights movement and everything, is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this backlash of response towards affirmative action, and other laws and policies that have been part of our, government for a while, and all of a sudden it's like we're going backwards?
What a wonderful question. What do others think? Somebody want to introduce themselves and give that one a shot, and then I'll give my response.
Hi, I'm Mary. Great question, Maureen. I think some of the backlash is that people have become more conscious and they're defending against it. And they're becoming more aggressive. And I
Say
think
what you mean by that.
well, I think that when we name these things, like racism and privilege and institutionalized racism, if anybody's listening, and I believe people are listening often within their own framework, I think it arouses a lot of feeling and defensiveness. And if there's an out, and I think our president provides that for some people, they'll grab onto it and they'll just push back because it makes them uncomfortable.
I was really struck by the first reading today, where the speaker says, well, watch out for people who come after you and say, don't challenge me because it's inconvenient. There it is.
Anyone else?
I have a question. What would be it that could people emotionally that mean?
That's a great question.
Can't hear the
Can you
question.
repeat it? I was wondering what killing of people emotionally might look like. And an example.
You said killing people emotionally?
Oh. All right, let me do two things at once, maybe. If I get lost, remind me where I was. Alan Johnson talks about something called the paradox of privilege. Paradox of privilege. And he defines that as one can receive social privilege simultaneously being socially unprivileged. So here's an example. And then I'll try to get to Mary's example. White women experience the paradox of privilege. Society privileges white women because they are white. But female is unprivileged. So simultaneously, one can experience privilege and unprivilege. And Johnson calls that the paradox of privilege. Now, with respect to, you want me to finish or you want to come in now?
I just wanted to add, I'm Elizabeth, an example from our book was the Jewish people in this country. They experienced both privilege, they were considered white, but still they were held back from joining a lot of clubs.
Yes. Or the Irish, or, you know, we've got lots of examples, right? Which is a good segue into another example of the paradox of privilege. You can be white and privileged, and from a lower socioeconomic background and unprivileged. So when people say to you, if you're white and from a lower socioeconomic background, and white people have a particular term for poor white people, what is that?
White trash.
So we understand the depth of the emotion, right? Someone were to call you that. That's an example. Someone were to call you that.
Oh, I see.
Then that is killing someone emotionally, right? You equated me with trash. Something of no consequence that you throw out.
No worth.
So when people who are having that experience hear that other people are being treated unfairly, right? Their reaction is what?
What about me?
Me too.
Yeah.
What about me? No one's ever given me anything. No one's ever helped me. Which essentially are the statements of a person that, or a group, that believe in one of the myths of the American society, which is what?
Bootstraps.
Yeah. Rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When the reality is, no one achieves anything all by themselves. Not even possible, right? You wouldn't even be born.
That's fun.
Speak up, Terry.
Okay, I've been aware of white privilege for a long time because I lived for years in Africa and because I have an adopted African son. And at one point when I had to do, and he has ADD, at one point when I had to go to the school, I had the privilege of being white. But when they saw that I had a black son, they acted like they didn't think I could string 3 words together. I suddenly went down in status. And yet, you know, I have my master's, I'm not in that socioeconomic, but at the time, I wasn't making very much money. And I was treated because people just make these assumptions. So you can lose part of your white privilege if possible.
And that's really what Johnson is talking about. You're describing it perfectly. Yeah. Is that at a certain level, we live in a hierarchical society, and things are quantified, right? And so if you're at the top of the hierarchy, you receive a certain kind of privilege. It's not the same if you're at the bottom. And that's part of that paradox of privilege. I did some consulting years ago. I lived in Huntington Beach, California, which is in Orange County. And I was asked to come in and do some work at the high school in Irvine. And here you have some of the wealthiest people in the United States living in Orange County. You have a huge military population, and then you have people who are very poor. So you have the whole spectrum going to this high school. And I was working for a high-tech company, and a coworker came into my office and she said, we need you to come and do something for us. I said, okay, well, what's the problem? There is neo-Nazi literature. Now, this is 1988. Not today, but could be today. Neo-Nazi literature being distributed on our campus. And so I came and, had a conversation with the principal, and they decided that they wanted me to do some work with them. And the first thing I did was I did what we would call today an equity assessment. Okay. So I talked with teachers, I talked with students. What is going on your campus? And I began to understand their campus. They had 3 or maybe even 4 levels of advanced placement. So they had students, high school students, who didn't spend any time in high school. They were already at University of California, Irvine, taking classes. And then they had, kids in the regular class, and then they had kids in special education. And to give you an understanding of what you're describing, there's a set of stereotypes about kids in special education, right? I mean, literally, once you get into special education, you can't get out. It isn't helping you gain skills so that you can go into regular education. It's a whole process, and it's quite stigmatized. Research is really very clear that you can't get out of special education, right? The kids who end up in special education are not considered intelligent enough to go back, the vast majority, into regular education. And what I discovered was, I came understanding that there were stereotypes about kids in special education. But there are also stereotypes about the teachers who teach kids in special education. And stereotypes about teachers who teach kids in regular ed. And stereotypes about teachers who teach kids in advanced placement. And who do you think are the stereotype says are the smartest teachers? Right? So not only are the children stereotyped and stigmatized, but so are their teachers. So I'm looking at this naive interviewer, which is what I always suggest I should be. If you want to understand something about education, don't hire an educator to help you assess it. You want to hire someone who hasn't a clue. They're going to bring fresh eyes to this issue. Right? No, as few preconceived notions as possible. So then we looked at the nature of the neo-Nazi literature. And what is the nature of that literature? It's essentially saying what? Yeah, that some people are better than other people.
And that it's meant to be
Yeah,
that way.
and supposed to be, and good.
That's
Right?
That's how it is.
That's right. And what are we teaching with all of these layers of stratification? That, let's use your words.
Hierarchy.
And it's meant to be.
It's meant to be.
Right? And so that was not, my report findings were not very popular.
They have effects.
Oh, I doubt it. And I'll tell you about that in a moment too. We're not popular because this outsider, she's not an educator, so what does she know? Is questioning this very progressive system that we put in place. But what we haven't looked at, which is the value of an organization psychologist, is the impact. The impact.
Can I bring up a point about talking about special ed? And the best teachers were thought at the higher stratosphere. I would think the teacher teaching special ed that moved that child out of special ed into the regular classroom would be the teacher of the year.
You're absolutely right.
But do we see that? Have we seen that?
The research says we don't see it. It's not the norm. Part of why it isn't the norm, Alan Johnson, who's a sociologist, would say, is because we take paths of least resistance. That you would have to take a path of greater resistance. So that's what Dominic is talking about. I'm going to call myself what I am, what I've learned that I am aware of that I am, and I'm going to take off my unconsciousness, and I'm going to look at the world, as my student says, once you see it, you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Once you see it everywhere. You know, when people come here from, I've had a lot of students who have immigrant backgrounds, and they'll be in my class. And they basically, somewhere along the way, you're right, you know, I get to hear everything because I ask people to write papers. And when they have to write every week, and when you have to write every week, you hear a lot about people. And I'm very good with my confidentiality. I'm a consultant by nature, and so all my students are my clients. But what you hear is how close socialization is to thinking. If you come from a country where you are actually privileged by race, so if you come from a country in Africa, what race has the social privilege? Black, right? Or if you come from China, I mean, unless you're Korean, right? Because that would be unprivileged. But if you're Chinese, you have the social privilege. So you come to the United States, where immediately you experience social unprivilege. Immediately, right? It is a very difficult concept for my students with immigrant experience to understand that social privilege is not a good thing. Alan Johnson says, anytime we experience social privilege, for me because I'm able-bodied, right? For me because I'm assumed to be Christian. I may or may not be, but I'm assumed to be. Anytime we experience social privilege, someone else simultaneously is being what? Is being oppressed. You can't have it both, we can't have it both ways. We think we can have it both ways. I'll just do something good with my social privilege. Yeah, right? But that's thinking that social privilege is an individual thing. Social privilege is conferred at the societal level, and we just act it out. So when you describe our language around gender, what you're asking us to do is to attack the societal structural levels by changing our language.
You got it.
Right? Yeah. The structural levels, not I'll be nice to you and you be nice to me.
And then we've got conflict.
Yeah. That's not going to change anything. That won't change anything. I mean, basically we got to change the construction of the pews in the church. Everything else is exactly why periodically we get a good glimpse of the progress we haven't made. Because we haven't, Alan Johnson would say, we haven't changed anything structurally. It's like I have this very high-tech aquarium, right? My son gave me this aquarium. It's called Biorb, English, very high-tech. And the basic premise behind it is tropical fish is a big industry. I didn't realize how big. Huge. The vast majority of people kill their fish, their first little fish, in the first 6 months, and then they never have fish again. Because it is a little heart-wrenching when those little things die. Anything you feed, as I tell my grandson, you start to care about. So the Biorb has a self-sensor for the heater. It senses the water every 30 seconds and adjusts the temperature because tropical fish need to be at a certain temperature. It has a very intelligent light system. Fish need to experience the whole full spectrum of light just like we do, from dark to light. And it changes automatically the light. Right? I got my high-tech air pump. Then I invested in this adaptation to Biorb, which is this filtering system, so that you really don't have to clean your tank. But I only change mine every 4 months. Some people are changing their tanks every 2 weeks. Every 4 months. And the water is, as the marketer of that system says, gin clear, and it really is beautiful. So on any given day, my tank looks magnificent. It is absolutely spectacular. But then I have to clean it. Here I come up on 4 months, right? And I got that. I'm checking my water quality, you know, for all these things that are invisible that I can't absolutely see that are affecting my tank water quality of it. And when I change it, all this muck comes up. Oh, it's just horrible. It looked great. But here's all this muck, detritus. And you vacuum it out, and then you put in, I usually do half a tank, because I only change the tank, clean the tank every 4 months. So I usually do a half a tank water change. That's what we've been experiencing. The detritus has always been there. Has always been there. And at periods in time, we look pretty good. And once we start thinking we look good, we start what? Believing we look good. We're good. We start believing it. Right? We start believing it. And really, we're just right where we have always been. There's not, well, we used to even believe that we didn't have the level of overt social injustice. Now we've been disabused of that illusion. And when my students do their research, those who come not believing that social injustice occurs don't leave not believing, because they have to pay attention to their own research.
My name's Peggy. In what you're saying, what bothers me is it seems to me that privilege means you don't have to pay any attention to it. You have it.
That's what Alan Johnson said.
Take it for granted. You don't think about it. You don't even realize it.
It doesn't bother you. It doesn't affect you.
It doesn't bother you till you start digging into it. If it doesn't bother you, you're buying into it without knowing it. So it's an unconscious decision. And the implicit, explicit is really scary to me, because I think when things are implicit, we don't need to pay much attention to them. And when people start feeling angry about things, it becomes very explicit. And it's easy for those of us who think our tank has been changed to not pay attention to what's happening with our leadership, what's happening in the White House, what's happening because now we've had a black president in Obama. And a lot of people are thinking racism is over.
That's right.
And it's not over until we understand the implicit ways that it's going on.
That's right. Because we have, many of you are my generation. And we spent our entire adult lives working for inclusion. What I tell my students, kicking the doors down, kicking the doors open, right? That I tell my students. I remember being 15, 16 years old, looking at the want ads for a summer job in Denver, Colorado. And at the one column, it would say women, and one it would say men. And there was no working across. You looked for jobs specific for women, jobs specific for men. I remember standing on a street corner with my mouth hanging open the first time I ever saw a woman drive a bus, drive a truck. It was just unheard of. It was unheard of.
Being a doctor.
Oh, unheard of, right? Unheard of.
An engineer.
Unheard of.
I haven't got to priest yet.
Yes,
Priest haven't gotten to priests yet.
You have to wear women's clothes.
Well, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book about paradoxical changes, the structure of, what's his book called? Structure of
Scientific
science,
revelation.
yeah, something like that. He says that within the priesthood, that change won't occur until you have, my words, a significant emotional, intellectual event.
Critical mass.
We might be in such a moment.
Let's hope so.
We might be in such a moment now.
If we are, don't we have to speak out? I mean, isn't it incumbent of us to realize that we might be, and if we aren't, to make it so?
Absolutely. That's what Alan Johnson says when he says we have to take paths of greater resistance. If we don't speak out, then our silence is collusion. Whether we need it to be or not.
Correct.
Whether we need it to be or not. Our silence is collusion. So we have to take those paths of greater resistance. When I talk to students about the difference between, I was in Washington, D.C. in a little shop one year, little gift shop. And there was a young woman who, for all intents and purposes, looked African American, except that she was from France. And she said, and we're chatting, and she said, I really like it here in the United States. And I said, why is that? This was maybe in the 80s. And she said, because black people have so much opportunity. And I said, yes, we do. And do you realize that people had to die for that opportunity? And she said, we would never do that in France. This is in the 80s now. Structural change requires a sacrifice. And basically she was saying, I don't think black people in France would sacrifice their lives for equality. But people's lives have been sacrificed here. So speak out. Well, what I tell my students is recruit allies and advocates. Recruit allies and advocates. It used to be, I was at the QFC on Broadway years ago, and it was a long line at the bakery counter. And we were just kind of inching our way up this line. And this gentleman was walking along the periphery looking in the bakery, display cases. And when he got to the front, now, here's this long line. When he got to the front, the salesperson said, "Sir, may I help you?" Now, what do you imagine that person looked like? Servant, right? Male, rich, affluent,
Well-dressed.
right? Yes. And here we were standing in that line. And we all just let him take his, let him do it.
Oh, my God.
That was in the 70s. More often than not today, someone will either say or tell you, the line starts back here.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah. Right? So I see that as a part of being an ally. Because it's easy to say, well, I'm next in line, and if the salesperson doesn't see you, you're invisible, I'll just take your place because I want to get out of here. In other words, use the privilege. I'll use my privilege. That social justice means I have to be willing to confront the privilege and to do it so regularly and so consistently that it begins to affect people at the subconscious level. Because we're not necessarily conscious of it.
Have you ever asked your students to write on when they have used their privilege?
Well, that's what they're doing when they have to do their social change projects. And that's what initially Robin DiAngelo would say, where the fragility comes into play. Because the avoidance, the resistance, the defensiveness is fragility. Here's what we spent 11 weeks understanding, to your point, but it's a little different. The learning is a little different.
It's very hard to look at when you use your privilege and you shouldn't.
Here's what you all are learning. Whether you started learning it today, or you've been working with Jan or Robin or those groups, call to action. When you see how privilege operates, and not just racial privilege, social class privilege, heterosexual privilege, religious privilege,
Age privilege.
isn't it the truth? Age, able-bodied. When you see it and begin that process of unpacking it, so I had a student, a very good student. It's not easy to get an A from me. She got an A, and this one too. She went home for Thanksgiving to Georgia. And she got an A in my cross-cultural competence course. And she certainly learned that saying nothing is collusion. And she's a very gentle person, so I can't imagine that she said anything kind of in your face. And her relatives at Thanksgiving dinner said, "They brainwashed you up there." The point being, when we become aware, and awareness just doesn't come. It's not like one day you're unconscious and the next day you're just aware of everything. It just usually comes, I might become aware about age, and then I might become aware about abilities, and then I might become aware about gender, and then I might become aware about gender identity, and then I might become aware about, and on and on. It's an unfolding, it's an evolving. But that evolving changes who I am. So the fragility, the resistance, the avoidance is resisting the change in one's identity. Because when my identity changes, my family is Catholic. Catholics are, for the most part, conservative. I don't care if we're Black Catholics, Hispanic Catholics, Asian Catholics, white Catholics. Typically conservative.
Not here.
Not here. That would be good. That would be good. So at my Thanksgiving dinner, my voice is not typically the popular voice. Because my family's conservative Catholic. All right? But in doing this work for almost 40 years now, more than 40 years, the work has changed me. I didn't start out for it to change me. So as you do the work, you will change. And as you change, the relationships with your family will change, and your friends will change, and your coworkers will change. What you will allow someone to say and do will change. As you push, as you engage in the path of greater resistance, the path of least resistance is just going along with it. Now, here's our challenge. We live in a democracy. And that means that people have the freedom of speech and the freedom of their religious beliefs. And so we have to balance our advocacy so that we, in the process, don't become another example in our hierarchical society of people that we think are better than. Because on the continuum of human difference, there go I, saying something unconsciously dumb and ignorant that I have yet to discover. And my most recent example of it is this. Probably you've heard this example. So I had a student 3 quarters ago, so fall, who presented as male, and despite the fact that the registrar named the student Katrina, let us know immediately the first day of class he was to be called Ken. And I went through that quarter just fine. I remembered. I referred to him as Ken. I thought that I got this transgender, gender identity stuff. 2 quarters later, which was last quarter, spring quarter, I had Ken again, different class. Ken presented more stereotypically as female. Pink hair, eyeshadow, short skirt. Still asked to be referred to as Ken and he. Some of the time I could do that, and some of the time I couldn't. Why not? so much, well, first of all, so much of what we think and say is unconscious. And so much of what we think and say is triggered unconsciously by what we see. So while the first quarter, no problem. And I thought, oh, I've arrived. I can check gender identity off of one of my boxes of my unconscious, thoughtless bias. By third quarter, I was mortified to know that I was nowhere really along that continuum, because it really doesn't matter what I see. It matters what the person has asked me to do. And it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what the person has asked me to do. People will forgive you what you said, and they'll forgive you what you did. But they will never forgive how you made them feel. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Will you come back?
I think you're in very good hands. A couple of things I wanted to share with you. Because Robin said that some of you are at the point, if I don't have enough, Robin and Jan will have these and can certainly probably see that you get something. We live in Martin Luther King Jr. County. How many of you realize that? Yes. We live in Martin Luther King Jr. County. And at least since 2012, but I think it actually started earlier than 2012, I became aware of the King County Equity and Social Justice Strategic Plan and Initiative. If you Google the 2012, you get kind of the baseline data about all the areas in Seattle, King County where we're not equitable, which is every area. We aren't equitable with respect to affordable, safe, quality housing, access to parks and natural resources, equity in county practices, access to affordable, healthy, local food, equitable law and justice system, all of it. Everything these are the root causes of inequity.
We need some more copies.
Yeah, I only had 20.
Okay.
We have a much bigger group. So hopefully.
And the circle gets the privilege.
So push it on back.
We got left out, huh?
So you can Google King County Equity and Social Justice Strategic Plan. It all comes right up. Right? So the question is, how might you get involved? Aware now? Everywhere. How might you get involved? When I think of homelessness, a certain image comes to mind. I want everyone to think about what image comes to mind when you think of homeless.
Drugs.
Tents, drugs, trash, what else? Hunger, color, racial disproportionality.
Health problems.
What, anything else?
There's a diversity.
Anything else?
Did we say drugs?
HIV now, that your problem in that group in the north end, that's the group of HIV, they are aware of.
This is what I think of.
To me, close to home.
Because remember, I'm a developmental psychologist
Yeah.
in my heart and an early childhood educator.
Underprivileged children. Is that what we're looking at, is children that are,
Homeless.
that's really hard.
And many of these children, I mean, their families didn't start out to be poor. Their families didn't start out to be unemployed. There's families, the research is really clear that drug and alcohol abuse comes after homelessness. That's a mental health issue. If I get evicted from my home, I'm much more likely to become homeless. If I lose my job. If this was the face that we thought about, what might we do
Provide housing.
to end homelessness? Well, I would suggest we would provide jobs.
Yes.
That the problem of homelessness, the lack of jobs, employment, and a living wage. And once my family is employed at a living wage, then all the rest follows. But if that isn't the case, and then the longer we are homeless, that you have a compounding of issues.
Yeah.
Right? Health issues, mental health issues, substance abuse issues. So,
Plus it becomes generational.
it certainly can be, because what we don't often realize is nobody makes it on their own, right? No one makes it on their own. If we would just learn our history. African Americans fought in the Second World War, but they didn't get the GI Bill, and they didn't get the home ownership provision.
Oh, the VA loans.
Yeah, read Color of Law, a book called Color of Law. It lays it out, official federal government policy. It was absolutely horrendous, and explains why there's this relatively small inequity with regard to wages, but there's a humongous inequity with regard to wealth in this country. And it all goes back.
And here in Seattle, it wasn't just in the
And
South.
so, what you leave your children, right? That legacy that our children are left with is tremendously different if you are not just among the poor, but among the working poor. People who work, which comprises a tremendous number of people experiencing homelessness, people who are going to work every day, can't afford a place to live. And that's not hard to believe now that we understand what housing costs in Seattle, King County. So every conceivable area you could become involved in. There's no shortage of ways to become involved. Then I gave you also a bibliography. Oh, I'm so sorry. I have one extra one. Sorry.
Send it down this way.
Didn't realize I had grabbed two. Then I've given you, in case you still want to read, there's a little bibliography about me, and then the link again to the county latest report, and then a bibliography. Lots of things that one can read. How many of you are grandparents? Just want to leave you with, I did a seminar for early childhood educators last year. And so I went into, I'm a researcher, so I went into the literature to see what I should be talking about with these folks. And because of the brain development research, we now know that a fetus intrauterally, before they're born, who hears multiple languages at birth can distinguish those languages. So if they heard English and Spanish at birth, when presented with sounds of multiple languages, they will attend to those languages, the languages they heard intrauterally. At 6 months of age, babies distinguish skin color differences. So there's no such thing as colorblind. At 6 months of age, babies can distinguish skin color differences. By 15 months, they can distinguish inequity. In other words, now that the vast majority of our kids are in daycare by the time they're 15 months, university research, early childhood programs are doing all kinds of research. A toddler recognizes when someone is being treated inequitably, and when the perpetrator is their same race, they gravitate towards the perpetrator. In other words, at 15 months, they understand privilege and power.
Wow. Do they gravitate towards the perpetrator out of fear?
No.
Protection.
Protect. No, that they will be the source of the power. Well, they will benefit. I mean, this is what is so amazing about these little young people.
So it's not out of fear then?
Siding with the winner. Yes, exactly. They actually can figure out that that is a good place to be. It's amazing. And that we know that 3/4 of our brain develop before birth and age 4. Wow. So these are very sophisticated children that we've just been dumbing down, right, for generations. My grandson said to me on Friday, I'll give you this one last thing. So researchers at Columbia University they're now describing the achievement gap. What do you think is the root cause of the achievement gap in school?
Poor nutrition.
That's a good guess, but
Not enough words.
they say the achievement gap is a 30 million word deficit. And now let's look at how social class comes in. That wealthy, upper class and wealthy children hear 30 million words by the time they go to kindergarten. And so when they get to kindergarten, it's just all clicking along because that's the way the brain works. It makes connections. If you've heard the word, understand the word, at least at some level, the brain is like a little file cabinet and it's just filing it away. And then when it presents itself elsewhere, it makes the connection. So school is a breeze. If you come from a background that's middle class, you children hear less than 30 million. I don't remember what it is, but significantly less. And vulnerable children from poor and working class backgrounds, 25,000 words. All right? So, of course, anyone who knows Dr. Wanda, I'm busy making sure that my grandson has his And so he's 3.5, and he's mastered opposites, and now we're doing synonyms. What's the synonym of home? He'll say house. So I said on Friday, I don't remember conversations with Nana, I don't remember how we got to this, but somehow, I was telling him how many names he had. That he was Camden, Ty, McGee, Hackett. He had 4 names. And then he said, well, how many do you have, Nana? And I said, well, I am Wanda. He's just learning that Nana isn't Wanda. I said, Wanda and Nana are synonyms. And he said, oh, okay. So I'm Wanda Louise Hackett. And we went through that whole little litany for everyone in our immediate family, right? And then he said, so how many names do I have? And I said, you're Camden Ty McGee Hackett. And he said, so Camden is a synonym for Hackett. And I was like, yeah. That he could actually make that association at 3.5 is amazing. And what I said to the preschool teachers, don't be afraid to teach them words. All these words are big words.
I think you're working on 40 million words.